Ambient occlusion is a type of special shadow casting that occurs based on the distance between your objects within a scene, and we use this to make the scene look more realistic. If you'll notice down here, we've got these, kind of simple shapes that are just made by extruding a few faces on a cube and adding some smoothing by tapping W. If I were to press render here, so we can get a kind of big shot of this fully rendered, this is what this looks like without ambient occlusion. So let's click ambient again and press render. And so one thing to be aware of when you are using ambient occlusion in Blender Render is that it will increase your render times. So you can actually increase the quality if under output options here, render quality, this basically just controls the ambient value if you're here in Blender Render, if you were to increase that value. But so if we were to press slot 1 versus slot 2, you can see the contextual distance-based shadowing that the ambient occlusion adds. So I'm going to press my go back button here to take us back to the 3D view. If I press this lights menu and drag this over, we'll notice, as with many of the features in our director's chair, when we activate that feature, we get new values to control. So now that ambient is on, we can control this ambient value, which we can see a representation of that down in the 3D view. The higher we drag this value, the darker the ambient occlusion gets, and the smaller we make the value, the less it gets. So if I were to crank this up, really high to say 1.45, and then we were then to render that out. And as you can see here, in this particular setup with the distance of these objects, having that ambient value up that high is causing us to really burn this out as compared to the one we just rendered with the lower value. So if I press go back here to take us back to the 3D view, you can view the effects of ambient occlusion in any 3D view window, such as this big one. If we were to press T and under shading, turn on ambient occlusion, we can see these kind of dynamic effects of the ambient occlusion. But be aware that if you turn on ambient occlusion here in the 3D view, but not down here in the director's chair menu, this will only turn on the visibility of the effects in the 3D view. If you click render, it's not going to render ambient occlusion unless you're using these menus down here. And that's because by default, when you activate ambient occlusion in the 3D view, Blender doesn't bother to also set that up to work when you go to render. That's something Sensei Format does down here. Another thing to note is that this effect isn't really available in cycles mode. So if down here we were to click use cycles here, notice that under the lights menu, we don't even have the option for ambient occlusion. And it is possible to use ambient occlusion effects in cycles mode, but it has to be done on a material by material basis for each object rather than just using a single setting to apply to the whole scene. So it's not really an option. So just so you're aware of that.